Donald Trump's political problem is no longer confined to Democratic criticism. Some of the most uncomfortable warnings are now appearing inside conservative media itself. The contradiction is hard to miss. Republicans insist the country is moving in the right direction, while their own allies are openly discussing gas prices, tariffs, voter anxiety, and the possibility of losing control of Congress. And if you're trying to understand what November could actually look like, the important question is not whether Fox News suddenly became anti Trump. It didn't. The question is why these problems have become difficult enough that even friendly outlets can't avoid them. Start with the number. Republicans have the hardest time talking around the economy. In one televised discussion, the president's handling of the economy was described as facing roughly 61% disapproval. Another figure put Trump's overall approval at 33%. Those numbers alone do not predict an election. Midterms are decided district by district. Turnout matters enormously, and national approval is not the same thing as a congressional ballot. But those numbers establish something Republicans cannot dismiss as merely Democratic messaging. Dissatisfaction is broad enough to become an electoral problem. And the issue showing up repeatedly is the simplest political question imaginable. What does life cost? Gas, groceries, cars, healthcare, household expenses. That matters because Republicans control the White House and hold narrow congressional majorities. Once a party controls the institutions capable of making policy, blaming the previous administration becomes progressively harder as an electoral argument. Voters eventually stop asking who created the original problem and start asking who has power right now. That pressure was visible when Republican National Committee Chairman Joe Gruters was asked how Republicans could convince Americans that they were the better choice to reduce the cost of gas and groceries. His defense was straightforward. He argued that Trump inherited problems from the Biden years, pointed to the previous inflation spike, emphasized tax cuts involving tips and overtime, and insisted the president was fighting for working Americans. That is probably the strongest Republican defense available. Economic conditions do not reset on Inauguration Day. Presidents inherit inflation trends, interest rates, supply chains, federal commitments, and international instability. A president cannot reasonably be blamed for every price movement occurring during his administration. But that defense has a limit. When an administration introduces new policies that themselves can increase costs, voters are entitled to separate inherited conditions from new decisions. And that brings us to Canada. During a Fox discussion about possible Canadian retaliation against American tariffs, one guest pointed to a detail that cuts directly through the political rhetoric surrounding trade deficits. The United States imports Canadian heavy crude because American refineries depend on it. Remove that component, he argued, and the broader trade picture looks considerably different. His larger warning was even simpler. Tariffs function as taxes on imported products, and prolonged uncertainty discourages investment and economic activity. That does not mean every tariff is automatically disastrous. Governments use tariffs for strategic leverage, industrial policy, and national security. There are legitimate arguments for protecting strategically important industries or responding to unfair trade practices. The real question is whether the economic benefit outweighs the cost imposed on Americans. Because a tariff does not magically stop at the border. Importers face the charge. Businesses decide whether to absorb it, reduce margins, change suppliers, or pass some portion of the cost forward. And when Canada retaliates against American products, American exporters can get caught on the other side. That makes the political geography especially important. Iowa was specifically raised because Canada is a major destination for its exports. Michigan is deeply integrated with Canadian manufacturing. Florida has an economic interest in Canadian tourism. Suddenly, an international trade confrontation becomes something much more politically dangerous, a local pocketbook story. And that is where the Republican problem begins to compound. Foreign policy can feel distant until it reaches a gas pump. Trade policy can feel abstract until it reaches a dealership. Tariffs can sound tough until somebody sees the new price. That distinction is already appearing in discussions about the conflict involving Iran. One poll cited in conservative coverage put approval for the war at only 31%, while the conversation immediately turned toward gasoline and grocery costs and whether those pressures could damage Republicans in close midterm races. Again, be precise about what that proves. It does not prove Republicans will lose the House. It does not prove one foreign policy decision determines the midterms. It proves Republican strategists have a reason to worry about the connection between international decisions and domestic prices. And then, something revealing happened on Fox. Jesse Waters interviewed Michigan Democratic Senate candidate Abdul El Sayed and pushed him repeatedly on issues including immigration, Sharia law, climate policy, taxation, and healthcare. Those are subjects a conservative audience cares about, and challenging a candidate on them is entirely legitimate. But El Sayed repeatedly redirected the exchange toward economic questions. He connected the confrontation with Canada to automobile prices. He argued for taxing extreme wealth. He challenged the cost of healthcare. His political strategy was obvious. Move the conversation away from ideological identity and toward household economics. Then came an unusual reaction. Waters said El Sayed was compelling and confident. He said he liked him even though he did not trust his politics and did not believe he was right for Michigan. That moment matters more than the compliment. A Democratic candidate entered an aggressively conservative environment, faced questions designed around conservative vulnerabilities, and still managed to keep dragging the argument toward affordability. That is a warning sign, because Republicans cannot assume cultural issues will automatically override economic dissatisfaction. If your grocery bill is higher, you notice it every week. If filling the tank hurts, you'll notice it immediately. If tariffs increase the price of something you need, no campaign slogan can make the receipt disappear. So, apply a simple standard here. If Democrats controlled Washington while prices were creating this level of voter anxiety, would Republicans accept we inherited it as a complete explanation? If the answer is no, the same evidentiary standard has to apply when Republicans hold power. And this is exactly where political information becomes dangerous for ordinary viewers. A claim can contain something true while leaving out the fact that changes its meaning. Don't Get Played gives you a repeatable way to catch that before you inherit somebody else's argument. The digital ebook is $9, one time. Use the first link in the description or pinned comment, because another number makes the economic argument even harder to contain. A correction aired concerning gasoline prices. A previous graphic had incorrectly shown the prior year's price as $4.13 per gallon. The corrected figure was $3.13, with the current comparison described as roughly 90 cents higher. The administration's position was that gasoline prices would decline quickly once operations involving Iran ended. That correction matters for two separate reasons. First, the original graphic was wrong and needed to be corrected. That is exactly what responsible political analysis should demand, regardless of which side benefits from the mistake. Second, correcting the mistake did not eliminate the underlying problem. The corrected comparison still showed a significant increase. That distinction is crucial. You do not defend a political argument by preserving an inaccurate number because it helps your side. You correct the number and then ask whether the corrected evidence still supports the conclusion. Here, the underlying affordability problem remained. Now consider the administration's defense. Prices will improve when military operations end. That could happen. A reduction in geopolitical risk can push energy prices downward. Markets can respond quickly to changing expectations. If the conflict de-escalates and supply concerns ease, consumers could eventually see relief. But politically, that defense creates another problem. It connects domestic affordability directly to the administration's foreign policy decisions. You cannot simultaneously argue that the conflict should not affect judgments about economic management and then promise that ending the conflict will bring prices down. Once the administration itself connects the two, voters are entitled to evaluate both together. And this is where the midterm discussion becomes much more serious than one bad poll. Republicans are defending narrow congressional majorities. That means they do not need a nationwide political collapse to lose control of a chamber. A relatively small shift among persuadable voters in competitive districts can matter. The question, therefore, is not whether Trump's core supporters suddenly abandon him. They may not. The question is what happens around the edges. What happens to the voter who supported Trump because groceries were expensive under Biden? What happens to the small business owner who liked the promise of lower taxes but now faces trade uncertainty? What happens to a Michigan family shopping for a car if components crossing the Canadian border become more expensive? What happens to an Iowa producer if retaliation hits exports? Those voters do not have to become Democrats. Some only need to become less enthusiastic Republicans. Some can stay home, some can split their tickets. That is how narrow majorities disappear. There is another piece of evidence Republicans should probably take seriously. The criticism is occurring in environments where Trump normally enjoys political protection. That does not mean Fox News or Newsmax has turned against him. Far from it. Conservative outlets still feature Republican officials, conservative arguments, and criticism of Democrats. That is precisely why the negative discussions matter. When opponents criticize a president, supporters expect it. When allies start asking whether his policies could cost his party seats, the informational value changes. One Fox discussion explicitly raised whether tariffs against Canada could hurt American consumers and pointed to the extraordinary economic integration between the two countries. Canada was described not simply as another trading partner, but as an ally whose relationship with the United States affects states from Maine and Michigan to Iowa and Florida. And that exposes the deeper contradiction. Trump's political brand depends heavily on strength. Tariffs are presented as leverage. Foreign policy escalation is presented as strength. Aggressive negotiations are presented as strength. But voters do not experience strength as an abstract concept. They experience consequences. If leverage produces a better agreement, supporters can point to the result. If tariffs protect American industry without imposing larger costs elsewhere, advocates can defend them. If military action produces a durable strategic benefit at an acceptable cost, the administration can make that case. But if the visible result is higher prices, uncertainty, and retaliation, the political definition of strength begins changing. Then, the administration has to prove the benefit, rather than simply announce the posture. Which should carry more weight when you judge a policy? The toughness of the rhetoric or the measurable result for the people paying for it? That is the standard Republicans themselves spent years applying to Democratic administrations, and it is now being applied to them. There is still plenty we cannot responsibly conclude. National polling does not tell us who will control the House after the midterms. Economic conditions can improve before Election Day. Gasoline prices can fall. Trade negotiations with Canada can restart. International conflicts can change rapidly. Republican turnout could outperform current expectations. Democratic candidates can make mistakes. Individual races would depend heavily on candidates and local conditions. So no, the evidence does not establish that Republicans are destined to lose Congress. It establishes something narrower and more important. The economic dissatisfaction is real enough that conservative media cannot simply quarantine it outside their audience. Republican officials are being forced to defend affordability. Tariffs are being discussed not only as negotiating weapons, but as potential costs. Foreign policy is colliding with gasoline prices. And Democratic candidates have an obvious incentive to keep redirecting cultural fights toward the household budget. That is the contradiction we started with. Republicans publicly project confidence, while some of the institutions closest to their own voters are openly discussing the conditions under which that confidence could fail. Trump still possesses enormous influence over Republican voters. Republicans still have multiple plausible paths to protecting their congressional power. But political control is not determined by confidence. It is determined by votes. And between now and the midterms, the most dangerous question for Republicans may not be whether voters approve of Trump personally. It may be whether those voters believe their own lives became more affordable while his party controlled Washington. Another poll: tariff announcement, military explanation, or viral political clip will soon ask you to make a judgment before all the context arrives. Don't Get Played is a digital method for becoming harder to manipulate and better able to defend your political convictions with evidence. It's $9, one time, through the first link in the description or pinned comment. Political reaction is instant. A defensible conclusion has to be earned.